So this is my third video in my series about episodes of Star Trek Voyager that ended up looking completely different to me the first time I rewatched them as an adult, usually because of meaningful or nuanced themes that I completely missed as a kid. I'm playfully calling the series Unforgettable Adult Moments in Voyager. I started with Faces and how it seems to be more about inner conflict than it is about, let's say, Vidian cave escape. And then I talked about Hope and Fear and how that episode becomes so much less boring when you realize that it's actually about, well, hope and fear. For this video, I want to talk about the season 2 episode, Persistence of Vision, and how that became a quote-unquote unforgettable adult moment for me, simply because it plays out such a vivid psychological, emotional allegory of sorts. Or at least for the second half of the episode, it seems to. I used to, every once in a while, hear these negative or neutral reviews of Persistence of Vision, and I would get kind of angry inside because I had found the episode so emotionally compelling, at least as an adult. And then I started to realize that actually, when you look at it and you look at the little bar on the thing, it's actually only the last 20 minutes of the episode that have the really intriguing stuff. The first 25 minutes, the first part of it, certainly that part's, it's this fun romp. It's really fun to watch. It moves from this lighthearted humor, these pleasant relationship dialogue bits, kind of moving toward this pleasantly spooky thriller mood that doesn't take itself too seriously. Fun to watch, but nothing that would make too much of an impact on you. But you do get that wonderfully shocking moment when the woman with the knife stands in the captain's doorway with her knife. That's pretty epic. But so here's just kind of a summary of the episode for those who might not remember it right off. The initial storyline is that Janeway is stressed and agitated. She tries to take a break by going to the holodeck. It turns out to be a very unrelaxing part of the holodeck program. But then when she leaves, she finds that she's seeing things from that spooky fantasy. She's seeing some things in real life. So she starts to wonder, am I so stressed that I'm losing touch with reality? Now, the idea in Star Trek of a character's fantasies coming to life in a kind of haunted house kind of way, and then questioning their sanity. Of course, that's not a new theme at all. I think it was done in a much more compelling way in the TNG Season 6 episode, Frame of Mind, in which Riker finds himself waking up in this unsettling mental hospital from this play he was rehearsing for. He finds himself waking up in that world. Very kind of similar in that sense. So certainly, this aspect of the episode is not one that's going to stand out as being remarkable or unique, just as one that's fun and pretty standard Trek fare. Also, another kind of odd fun fact in this episode, in the psychological domain, twice in the episode, B'Elanna refers to the captain's hallucinations as delusions, kind of an odd mistake for the writers to put in there. It's not a mistake that any of the other characters' lines of dialogue have, if I'm remembering that correctly. At least I didn't notice any. What's interesting about that is, properly speaking, a delusion would refer, for example, if the captain were to see two cups that actually are kind of similar, but she would load meaning onto it as to why they're similar. Rather than what happens in this episode, the captain actually visually sees a cup that's not there, so it's a hallucination. And the captain in those scenes, she's clearly not delusional in the sense that her first response to seeing these two similar cups that are identical, her response is to say, and this is a quote, I'm pretty sure, I simply have to remind myself that coincidences do happen. That's what she says. So in contrast to that, a delusion, such as you might see, let's say, in a delusional disorder, that would relate more to where the sufferer, the Janeway in the story, is committed to a certain seemingly arbitrary interpretation of events, such as if the captain, she sees the identical cups, and then she's convinced that Neelix has been doing this in order to confuse her and take over the ship. That would be more of a delusion. There's actually another episode of Voyager that does talk about delusions, actual delusions, and in a very intriguing way. And that's the 6th season episode called The Voyager Conspiracy. That's the episode where 7 of 9 assimilates too much information through her. She gets this new piece of thing where she can assimilate all the info from the databanks, but she gets too much info too fast, and she ends up concluding, based on circumstantial evidence, that the entire crew is against her. So that's a pretty intriguing, pretty good episode talking about delusions, not hallucinations. So it's just kind of funny, little fun fact that a little bit here. So anyway, that's talking about the first 25 minutes of the episode, the captain having her little thrill ride. Kind of fun, kind of spooky in a lighthearted way, not all that deep or enlightening or meaningful. But the last 20 minutes are where things get interesting. The turning point, I guess, would probably be when the alien shows up on the bridge. And then everyone starts seeing things. What makes it intriguing is that none of these hallucinations are meaningless. They're not random images. They aren't even exactly like dreams. I think in what I seem to gather is that the point of each hallucination is that each hallucination is subjectively irresistible. And as the watcher, as me or as you, if you put yourself in the head of each of those key characters and you watch their reactions, part of what I love about it is that you can feel that irresistibility, and you can feel the battle that each character is going to lose. And in a way, is that really so different from the life in which most of us live? Because while we don't have aliens trying to draw us in through these psionic waveforms, we all have moments in our lives when we're trying to stay focused on the events of the day at work, for example, but something else is tugging at us inside. Something else is demanding that we succumb and that we spiral out with it far away from the present reality. And if any one of us constantly is in this fight against these merciless tugging and taunting thoughts, if we're like that, kind of like a castle under siege, we'll eventually end up doing what the bridge crew did. We'll eventually succumb, because you can't fight that kind of battle constantly, permanently. Back when I was a kid, whenever I thought of this episode, if you were to say what images pop in your head, I probably would have been, the series of images would have probably been kind of the sci-fi headline shot. So it'd be the captain with the cup that had the flowers on it in the mess hall. And then maybe that shocker moment with the woman with the knife in the doorway. You can't forget that one. Or maybe the image of the ugly alien. So maybe you put those images together. That would be how I would have remembered the episode. But as an adult, when I'm older and I'm so much more captivated by emotional impressions and things like that, now when I think of this episode, I see a succession of images that all begin at that 25-minute mark. First, I see Tom on the bridge succumbing and all the others. I see Kes on her way to engineering. And then I see this final showdown between Kes and the alien. So I just want to talk through why it is that I find each of those so compelling and how they tie into real life stuff. So first, I listed that image of Tom staring at his father, or this fake father, and succumbing to stupor. And this is moments after he had just told the captain that it wasn't even tempting. And the captain says, "Don't look." And Tom says, "Don't worry, it's not even tempting." Now, I don't for a moment think that these words that Tom is hearing from the false father, I don't for a moment think those are actually words that Admiral Paris would say. Admiral Paris, that's not the vibe you get from him throughout the series. I think these are what Tom feels his dad ought to say. Because remember the kind of life Tom has lived and how he has disappointed his dad. He actually has. Seems to me these are probably words that Tom feels deep down that he deserves to hear. And so he has this desperate need that he feels to make those words untrue. And he's living his life to make those words untrue. Because Tom, while he said the hallucination wasn't tempting, the fact of the matter is, Tom didn't actually know what he would find so compelling. He didn't know what it would take to irresistibly grab his attention. And then, of course, along with this image, we have the rest of the bridge crew, each one of them with their own unique hidden tenderness that you may or may not have thought of beforehand. Each one has their unique kind of attentional intrusion that they can't or won't resist. And then so that was the first image I mentioned that stands out to me. The second image is so if you could say the interest of the episode, for me at least, begins when the alien appears and we get to see kind of the inside of all these people. Well, if that's the interest beginning, then the rising action, kind of the precursor to the climax, seems to me, at least it feels to me, to be the point when Kes is running down the halls trying to get to engineering, and she ends up being distracted by her greatest attentional temptation. And for her, it's the felt need to be compassionate and to help others, especially this hallucination that's shouting out, crying out for help. And the only way that she's able to maintain her present moment wholeness, the only way she's able to save everybody, is by walking away while somebody is screaming after her, "Don't leave me, it hurts." And then we've got the third image that pops in my head when I think of this episode. And this is the epic climax when Kes, quote, "can't lift her head." And I'm quoting from the evil alien. It says, "What's the matter? Can't lift your head?" You know, which he says derisively to put her down, but it's actually got a little bit of truth to it. Yeah, that's the one quotable quote. The other quotable quote that I always remember from this episode is "When the going gets tough, you crumble," which is quite an epic quotable little bits there. Now, of course, with Kes, lifting her head at that very key moment. Of course, there's a nice little quirky sci-fi reason that Kes needs to lift her head. Of course, there is. So she can reflect back the psionic, image back onto itself like a mirror and all that, whatever on earth any of that means. But who cares about quirky sci-fi explanations? The fact of the matter is, Kes needs to lift her head because we all need to lift our head when we're cowering and writhing in agony because of the lies and delusions and whatever it is that's so to speak making the flesh rot off of our own face. I mean, for me, I don't think I could ever watch this episode and not see this long image about mental health with this distinctly spiritual flavor to it. Of course, I'm talking about the last 20 minutes for the most part. Because let's face it, we all have, as it were, voices screaming out for our attention, which want to suck us into a hole that's going to be very hard to come out of. Maybe that hole for you might be depression, let's say anxiety, let's say lethargy, let's say unmotivatedness, or let's say just a torrent of tears that would be very inappropriate because you're currently in a meeting at work, you're trying to get through the meeting, and then, maybe what it is that's pulling you toward that hole, maybe what's pulling you in might be hopelessness, it might be painful memories or traumatic memories, or it might be catastrophic thinking or long lost dreams. I mean, fill in the blank. But when we're in the present moment, whether you're at work or you're trying to get through a party, a birthday party with friends, or you're trying to get through, fill in the blank, and you're trying to get through it without being yanked and grabbed downward toward that spiraling pit by these intrusions. And now that kind of way of looking at it especially applies to someone who might be struggling with the kinds of intrusive thoughts that might be associated with clinical OCD. One of the leading empirically verified approaches to handling OCD is called acceptance and commitment therapy for OCD. It's just a subcategory of ACT therapy. And it teaches that the best answer to handling chronic intrusive thoughts or impulses of the OCD variety, the best answer to them, according to this model, is not to answer these intrusive thoughts or to fight them, but instead to refuse them the dignity of being confronted at all. So according to this model, whether you would succumb, by opening your heart to planet Vulcan, just giving into the idea that's popping in your head, when you need to be present on the bridge and you let yourself just go there. Or on the other hand, whether you do the opposite and you succumb by fighting back, let's say by talking back to the false father who's telling you lies. Either way, according to the ACT approach to intrusive thoughts for OCD, either way, you've succumbed. Either way, you're giving attention to these intrusions, and the more attention they get, whether you're fighting them or giving into them, either way, the more attention you give them, the stronger they get, and the more likely they are to come back and pop in your head again when you're trying to live life. And these things keep popping in and trying to take over. But the story wouldn't be over if it was just telling us to look away. Certainly it's true that we all are going to at some point need to build the skill of looking away when one of these things is trying to grab us and drag us somewhere. We've got to live life. But how long can anybody live if you're constantly trying to avoid something that's so powerful? So the story could never be complete just with that part. It would never be complete until it included a little bit of, let's say, looking up and looking on. So the epic climax of the episode is this part when Cass, quote unquote, can't lift her head, as the alien puts it derisively. But of course, she can lift her head. And of course, so can you. Nobody naturally is just going to look up when you're writhing in agony. Because when you're writhing in agony, that's the point when the only thing you can see, let's say the only thing that exists in the entire world is the agony you feel. Nothing else is real. So to lift your head and look up in that painful moment is the greatest pain. It is the unbearable pain. Now, when I see this particular scene, I actually see a bit of a double metaphor, and I'm not sure if it was intended to have a double metaphor. I think it's pretty clear that it's intended to speak in a metaphorical way. But I see kind of two. I see the powerful image of looking up, which I would see as a directional change full of all kinds of metaphorical significance, but also a compelling image of looking on, in the sense of she's looking someone or something straight in the face, which she would prefer to hide far away from. I mean, isn't that what we're trying to avoid? Isn't the problem that we've been talking about, isn't the problem when you look in the face, let's say you're standing on the bridge, you give it your attention, you succumb to distraction, you enter the stupor of the forward gaze, you're taken over. Isn't that the problem? But in fact, you've got to do both. You got to know how to look away when it's time to look away, but you also got to know how to look straight on when it's time to look straight on. The portrayal of the actress in the scene is especially fitting with the way I'm interpreting the episode. Because remember, she's in agony, she can't lift her face. It doesn't take any imagination for you to feel with her that she simply can't lift her face. But then moments after she's locked eyes with the source of her pain, just notice her expression. She doesn't ball up her fists and clench her jaw and muster up all the power to defeat him. She doesn't rage or brace herself against a wall. Instead, she relaxes and holds her head straight, keeping her eyes calmly where they need to be. So she remains face to face, breathing normally, unmoving and unmoved. She doesn't recover from all this pain by, let's say, falling back or by charging ahead. Instead, she recovers from her pain by facing forward with a gentle, serene acceptance of what is really there, breathing calmly and watching what will unfold. Now, maybe at this point you're thinking, okay, this guy's just stretching things. This episode isn't actually about emotional and cognitive acceptance. But let's remember what ends up being said in some of the final moments of the episode. There's that little epilogue scene between B'Elanna and Janeway. B'Elanna asks Janeway if she, do you think it's true that the alien's painting all these pictures for us based on what it could see is actually inside our minds? And Janeway says, it certainly seems so. And B'Elanna admits, she's got this distant look and she kind of admits, she says, it's just, I experienced some things I'd rather not admit. And you'll remember that one kind of dreamlike moment where she finds this version of Chakotay who's madly in love with her, which I think that scene, I think it points not to the fact that she had feelings for Chakotay, because you don't see any indication of that. But instead, I think that points to the fact that B'Elanna had this powerful and suppressed longing for intimacy, which had nothing to do with Chakotay per se, but everything to do with her own suppressed longing to have somebody who's in love with her and who she's not going to feel this compulsive need to push away with that kind of abrasive self-protectiveness that B'Elanna has toward anybody who might be in that category. So anyway, so B'Elanna says, she experienced something she'd rather not admit. But then from Janeway, we get this line. Janeway says, maybe in a small way, the alien did us this favor. And then she says, and I think this is a direct quote, she says, maybe it's better to look those feelings in the eye than to keep them locked away. Well, there we go. Seems to me that's supposed to be the point of the episode, thematically speaking. Captain Janeway's moral to the story. We can either look those unwanted feelings in the eye, or we can try to keep them locked away continuously. And I would add to that, perhaps the deeper in the cellar we keep them locked away, the more power they gain. Perhaps the deeper in there, the longer we keep them in there, the more chance there is that they might just tear out of the depths at the most problematic times and cause trouble that we weren't counting on. And perhaps if we instead learn to look them in the face gradually and calmly, we might be able to gain some of the strength of acceptance, which happens to be the very same kind of strength that's the only thing that's going to help you when you're standing on the bridge, trying to stay in the present moment, and you've got all this internal debris flooding your soul with mental noise, trying to suck you into the hole. So anyway, that's why this particular episode is one that I found really compelling as I think back on it. And certainly that first time I saw it as an adult, I was just like, wow, all this was in there. And of course, I'm not talking about parsing it out as some kind of, technical allegory. I'm just talking about the impression you get watching it and seeing these themes of being pulled by what drives you, and of learning how to look up and look right on instead of running away from something. So when I remember this episode now as an adult, the series of images that I get, starting with Tom succumbing because he's heard these negative words and he has to answer, to the picture of Kes running down the hallway, having to overcome her felt need to answer these desperate pleas. And then to that final compelling climax in which you have to lift your head because you have to look up and look on. So those are the images that have stayed in my head and made this really to be a unforgettable adult moment, if you'll pardon my quirky little snarky expression there. Because sometimes those old reruns that you've seen a billion times, they just seem to play differently after you've been busy living life. Next up in this series, I'll be talking about The Thaw, also from season 2, and what I find so compelling there about fear and all that good stuff.